Guantanamo was that role to defend religious freedom. I became a Muslim chaplain in January of 2001 after having converted to Islam, learning a little more in depth about the faith, even studying a little bit of the Arabic language to be able to recite the Holy Quran in its classical form. I then returned to the U.S. Armed Forces as a Muslim chaplain in 2001, January. 2001, the world knows what happened in that year, in September 11th, 2001. The tragic attacks on the World Trade Center and on the U.S. Pentagon happened on September 11th. At that particular time, I was a Muslim chaplain serving in the U.S. Armed Forces. It was almost immediately following these attacks that I was approached by senior level leaders, and they would ask me if I would begin training, teaching Islam and the Muslim culture to the soldiers who were serving within the ranks. I would hold lessons, briefings, lectures about Islam, educating those troops. I would begin to receive praise and recognition as someone who was building bridges of understanding, helping these young men and women become better soldiers. I look back on that experience now and speculate that I was asked to do this job because senior level leaders in the military knew following 9/11 that soldiers of the U.S. military were going to be deployed, sent to Muslim nations, Muslim countries like Afghanistan, like Iraq, and like the many other Muslim nations where you find U.S. troops deployed to today. But nevertheless, in carrying out this duty, I educated troops about Islam and the faith that I converted to. That praise and recognition came from the highest levels in the Pentagon, in the State Department, and I believe it was that praise and recognition that I received in the immediate post-9/11 aftermath that landed me the assignment in Guantanamo Bay, the prison camp, where hundreds of prisoners have been held in this so-called war on terror. In fact, every prisoner that has been held in Guantanamo has been a Muslim. Every prisoner that has been held by the U.S. military in Guantanamo has been Muslim. And when I was sent there in November of 2002, there were some 660 or so prisoners, all of them Muslim. I look back at that assignment when I was given the orders to go to Guantanamo Bay. I speculated then as well that perhaps I was being sent as a Muslim chaplain to Guantanamo Bay so that my government, so that my nation could say to the world that yes, indeed, there were hundreds of Muslim prisoners being held in Guantanamo Bay, but that also we had in Guantanamo Bay our U.S. Army Muslim chaplain. And that, perhaps, would be an indication to the world, to the international community, that the United States was treating these prisoners in Guantanamo Bay humanely. That the United States was being sensitive to the religion, to the faith of these prisoners, which was Islam, which is Islam. I thought perhaps that was the reason behind me being sent to Guantanamo. Well, when I got down to Guantanamo as the Muslim chaplain, I learned that I did have two roles to play. One role was to be an advisor to the camp commander on how religion affected this military detention operation, how the religious practices of these prisoners, these Muslim prisoners, affected the detention operation. That was my first role as an advisor. The second role that I had was to be a chaplain to all of the Muslims in Guantanamo. Not only the 660 or so Muslim prisoners, but I was also a chaplain to the many American Muslims down in Guantanamo. Yes, there are also American Muslims in Guantanamo, but not as prisoners. There are many American Muslims who work down in Guantanamo, serving mostly as translators. Imagine At that time, 660 or so Muslim prisoners being held in Guantanamo. How many languages do you think were spoken in this prison camp? Many languages, from Arabic to Pashto, Farsi, Urdu, Turkish, Chinese. European languages included German, French, Russian. Who handled the linguistic needs of this military prison operation? Translators, American translators, most of whom were American Muslims. I was a chaplain to the American Muslims, as well as a chaplain to the Muslim prisoners. But in my role as a chaplain to the Muslim prisoners, I was given authorized, unescorted access into the prison cell blocks. I was one of the very few individuals who was allowed to speak openly and freely with the Muslim prisoners. And in that dialogue, in that conversation, in that personal interaction with these prisoners in Guantanamo, I learned a lot of what was really going on inside this prison camp. Not only inside the prison cell blocks, but also inside the interrogation rooms. In Guantanamo, there are two operations. There's a detention operation where the prisoners are being held in the cell blocks. Back then, they were being held in what was like caged-like cells. That part of the operation was ran by guards, military police, who handled the everyday needs of the prisoners, like bringing the prisoners their food, their change of clothes, escorting prisoners to recreation, those types of things. That's one side of the operation. The other side of the operation is the intelligence gathering operation, where interrogators and military intelligence officers interrogate the prisoners to try and extract information from them. Well, I learned of the abuses that was going on in the cell blocks and in the interrogation rooms, not only from the prisoners directly themselves, but also from many of the American translators who worked in these intelligence and guard operations and had much information about those transgressions. As a U.S. Army chaplain, whose role was to defend religious freedom, I became very disturbed learning how religion in Guantanamo was being used as a weapon. Yes, religion was being used as a weapon in Guantanamo. And because each and every one of the prisoners in Guantanamo is a Muslim, it was the use of Islam, the Muslim faith, as a weapon against these Muslim prisoners. And I want to share with you a little bit about how that was being done. How these individuals in Guantanamo were being persecuted for their faith, for believing in one God, for believing in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of the ways in which this was being done is something the world learned about in 2005, first from a Newsweek magazine article, which reported that the Holy Quran down in Guantanamo Bay was being desecrated by U.S. personnel. As the Muslim chaplain who was down in Guantanamo Bay in late 2002 and most of 2003, I will confirm that the Holy Quran, the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala azza wa jal, was disrespected and desecrated by U.S. personnel. Guards, when they searched the cells of the prisoners, and in any prison operation, of course, there's a need for security operations. But when prisoners searched the cells, they searched the belongings, the items, and when they came to the Holy Quran, they would turn it upside down and violently shake it, thinking that something dangerous might fall out. But instead it was the bindings of the Mus'haf, of the Quran itself, that were torn, that were cracked, that were ripped, along with many of the pages. And when guards finished searching through the Quran, they recklessly tossed the Quran onto the floor. Because the prisoners were being held in these open-aired cell-like cages, they could observe how the guards were conducting the search and how they were disrespecting the words of Allah. And the prisoners became angry. It became furious, and they began to protest. They banged on their steel beds. They banged on their steel doors in protest of how the Holy Quran was being disrespected. Their protests then turned to hunger strikes and even suicide attempts. Some of the Muslim prisoners in Guantanamo tried to hang themselves in their cell in protest of how the Holy Quran was being disrespected. Those more extreme measures of protest occurred when it was learned by prisoners that the Qurans were being taken into the interrogation room. And as a Muslim prisoner sat shackled in his chair at the wrists, waist, and ankles, an interrogator would take the Quran and slam it in front of him on the floor, stamp on it, kick it, even sit on it. Later, there were investigations that were carried out into abuses towards the Holy Quran, conducted by the U.S. military itself. And they revealed that even the Holy Quran was at times urinated on by U.S. personnel. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah.